while American anti-communist and anti-Soviet policies have been portrayed in the media and by government as being understandable defenses against the Soviet. Did I do something wrong here? As a threat to Soviet aggrandizement, that is, that they were defensive responses to something called the Cold War, and that Cold War started in 1946 or so when Russia proved itself to be an expansionist and menacing power. That's the standard scenario. In response to that aggrandizement and that menacing, we alerted ourselves to the Soviet menace, and we educated the American public to that menace. And we reacted to it with the NATO shield, with the armaments, with interventions in various countries, the Truman Doctrine and all that stuff. Now, very recently, the American Historical Association published a set of documents that were rather intriguing, which they got out of the State Department under the Freedom of Information Act, which shows that people in the State Department never believed that the Soviets had any intention or any interest or any capability of invading Western Europe in the late 1940s or in the 50s or 60s or today, for that matter. But nevertheless, and it's a kind of mind-blowing thing for that generation of us who were raised in that post-war era and heard constantly about the Soviet menace in Europe and were treated to visions of Soviet troops marching under the Arc de Triomphe and all that sort of thing. And told that what we needed above anything else was a NATO shield. What I want to point out tonight is that anti-Sovietism began well long before what was called the Cold War and long before the Soviet Union became the kind of power it is today. It really goes back to a time before there ever was the Soviet Union. All through the 19th century, you will find that the press, joined by the pulpit, the politicians, the police, the professors, and the plutocracy, all of them propagated this picture that American life was facing a certain danger, and that was the danger of syndicalism, socialism, radicalism, anarchism, communism, all of which tended to get lumped together as one great danger to the American way of life. Any proposed departure from the capitalist social order was characterized as a departure from all order itself and a plunge into anarchy. Thus, as early as 1880, Roscoe Conkling could hail President Ulysses Grant. Roscoe Conkling was the boss who made Ulysses Grant, but anyway, he could hail him then as, quote, an eternal foe of communism, lawlessness, and disorder, lumping communism with disorder and lawlessness. So that any move toward another social order, an alternative social order, is really characterized, or rather the end of the capitalist social order, as I said, is characterized as the end of all social order. Capitalism was equated with true Americanism, while socialism was depicted as a kind of an alien virus that affected the American body politic. In fact, by the way, in the late 19th century, probably some of the most powerful socialist movements, most active movements in the world were going on in the U.S. Certainly some of the most militant worker struggles were going on. Enough so to catch Marx's attention. Marx wrote to Engels, he said, what's with the American workers? It's rather unusual, rather massive strikes. Well, then came a most remarkable and most significant historical event, which changed the course of world history. And that was the Russian Revolution of 1917. The specter that had haunted Europe, the specter of communism, was now being realized, was being embodied. Here was not just a workers' rebellion, there had been many workers' rebellions and many workers' revolutions. Here was one that succeeded and took over a rather large country. And there's a remarkable correspondence that took place between Secretary of State Lansing and President Woodrow Wilson, in which Lansing wrote that the Bolsheviks are wanting in political virtue. They would preach to the common man that one could reach an elevated height by dint of political means rather than by hard work. This would be a most unfortunate, I'm paraphrasing from memory, this would be a most unfortunate example to the common man in our country and other countries. They were very much aware that this revolution that had taken place had torn the fabric of bourgeois history. There was now a different kind of social force actually taking over and commanding state power. By the way, is this being videotaped? Did you say it was? I was wondering why the cameras, I couldn't see a camera, but I see the lights blinding. So from the very beginning, they saw a threat. It wasn't Stalin's divisions. It wasn't Khrushchev's missiles. Long before that, when it was a country which itself was then invaded by 14 Western capitalist countries, including the United States, to overthrow this newly instituted Soviet government, from the very beginning, the Western leaders understood that this was a threat. Not a threat to democracy, because half of them didn't have any democracies themselves, and they felt perfectly at home instituting brutal colonial rules throughout Africa, Asia, and Latin America with no concern for democracy. Not a threat to the world's stability in the sense that this was going to cause further wars, because the worst and most vicious wars were being fought among the capitalists themselves for markets and colonies and such. They were the destabilized. It was a threat to capitalism. It was a threat to that process of capital accumulation, which is the substance and mainstay of this society and every other capitalist society. It was presenting an alternative social order, one which used the land, the labor, the technology, and the capital of that society, not for the private capital accumulation process, but for social needs in a planned manner, with all its imperfections and problems, was decidedly and still is a different kind of way of organizing your political economy. A different kind of society, and the end of a capitalist class society. The propaganda war against the Red Menace then intensified soon after the Russian Revolution. I want to quote historian Robert Murray in his book, The Red Scare. Anti-Bolshevik testimony was played up in the columns of the nation's newspapers, and once again the reading public was fed on highly colored tales of free love, nationalization of women. By the way, that was a common story in the media in those days, that Lenin nationalized women. The women were put on nationalization. They became part of public ownership, and you can, I don't know exactly how that worked, but nationalization of women, bloody massacres, and brutal atrocities. Stories were circulated that the victims of the Bolshevik madmen customarily had been roasted to death in furnaces, scalded with live steam, torn to pieces on racks, or hacked to bits with axes. Newspaper editors never tired of referring to the Russian Reds as assassins and madmen, quote, quote, human scum, crime mad, and beasts. This is Murray. In the aftermath, by the way, of World War I, some rather extraordinary things were happening in the United States itself. 2 million workers were on strike, including 500,000 coal miners, 350,000 steel workers. And immediately the press began to link the domestic unrest to the Soviet menace, to, after all, delegitimate the domestic unrest, and to alarm the public with sensational headlines like, quote, Red Peril here, quote, plan bloody revolution, quote, want Washington government overturned. A special Justice Department publicity bureau was set up. Very interesting. And its function was to plant stories in newspapers about a Moscow-directed plot to overthrow the U.S. government. By the way, that process is still going on. I mean, U.S. government agencies are still planting stories, feeding them to the media about anti-communist phobias. The FBI has done that. The CIA is forbidden by law to do it, but they do. The CIA often plants the stories abroad, and by what's called a process of blowback, the story gets back into the U.S. They'll plant a story, that story they planted of Cuban troops massacring innocent people in Angola, villages in Angola, was a total CIA disinformation fabrication story planted in Western Europe, but it gets picked up in the newspapers, and then U.S. journalists and wire services pick those stories up, thinking they're from independent journalists, and we're treated to them here. So the CIA indirectly plants here. So there are people who do this all the time. There also occurred at that time a Justice Department action. Raids. The Justice Department, assisted by state and local police, hit concurrently 20 cities, hundreds of raids, arresting thousands of leftists, including many trade union militants. The key organization working at that time was a group called the Special Bureau of Investigation under a young Georgetown lawyer. In 1919, this was named J. Edgar Hoover. It was later changed to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But as early as 1919, Hoover was doing this sort of thing. He had quite a long career. To these raids, in which hundreds of people were deported without any due process, thousands were thrown in jail without any due process, the New York Times hailed the Palmer raids with this headline: "Reds plotted countrywide strike. Arrests exceed 5,000. The Philadelphia Public Ledger greeted the Boston police strike, which occurred soon after that. Bolshevism in the United States is no longer a specter, meaning it was a reality. And the Wall Street Journal headline screamed, "Lenin and Trotsky are on their way." Now, there was a nightmare. There was something very frightening happening. But the nightmare wasn't revolution, it was reaction, and it was a real one, and the job was done. Under the Palmer raids, under the combined force of industry, government, and press, the major strikes were broken. Wages were driven down, the open shop was restored, and the ranks of the unions were decimated. And profit levels were secured. The government industry press campaign against the Red Menace continued all through the 1920s into the 1930s, and intensified in about 1936, 37, 38. Again, as the struggles of the CIO and industrial workers intensified, so then did the red-baiting hysteria about Moscow-directed plots, about Reds infiltrating our institutions and our life, and that sort of thing.